This is yet another incredible story about a boy who believed that he could remember who he was in his past life. You have to see this for yourself to be able to comprehend this. Check it out.
You look around the house, that's all you'll see. Airplanes, helicopters, aircraft carriers. So one day I was in the kitchen, I was washing dishes, James had breakfast, and in the airplane, he was just flying around like this. And he goes, "Mama, before I was born, I was a pilot, and my airplane got shot in the engine and crashed in the water, and that's how I died." And I was just froze. It was such a bizarre thing to say, but it was just that matter of fact. There was no drama, there was no emotion to it.
So we're cleaning up the yard. He's playing in the leaves. I said, "I just love you to bits." And he goes, "Well," he said, "I knew you'd be a good daddy when I picked you." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Well, when I found you, Mommy, I knew you would be good parents." One day I asked him why he's calling himself James 3. Well, it's because I'm the third James. He pointed to it and he goes, "Daddy, that's where my airplane was shot down." And I said, "What?" He said, "That's my airplane got shot down there, Daddy." And I just went blank.
I'd wake him up and he'd be screaming and he'd always be laying on his back, kicking his feet up at the ceiling. And I'd say, "Baby, what were you dreaming about?" And he'd say, "Airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out." Bruce said, "What happened to your plane?" He said, "It crashed on fire." And Bruce said, "Why did your airplane crash?" And he said, "It got shot." And Bruce said, "Well, who shot your plane?" And I'll never forget the look on his face. He went, "Oh, the Japanese." I was reading to James, and then he sat up and he goes, "Mama, the little man's going like this." And he laid down, and he goes, and he did the same thing he did in his dream. He was kicking his feet up, and he goes, "The little man's going like this. Ooh, 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 can't get out, can't get out." And I sat him back up, and I said, "Who's the little man?" And he goes, "Me." It still makes my hair stand up. And Bruce said, "What happened to your plane?" And he said, "It crashed on fire." And he said, "Why did your airplane crash?" And he said, "It got shot." Another night, Bruce had come in and he said, "Do you remember where your plane took off?" And he said, "It took off of a boat." "Do you remember the name of your boat?" "Natoma."
So I said, "Well, did your boat have a name?" And he said, "Natoma." And I'd never heard the word before. And I went down the hall and got onto the computer and Googled it. And down around hit 300, all there was this thing, Natoma Bay, CVE 62. Clicked on it, and up comes this history of a World War II aircraft carrier. I had no answers. How could he know this? How could he know a person? How could he know a ship? And I had no answers. How could he know this? How could he know a person? How could he know a ship? And what did all this mean? So that was where I really just said, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. I don't know how I'm going to do it.
He called me on the phone and he said, "You won't believe this. There's only one guy from Natoma Bay who was killed during the battle for Iwo Jima, and his name was James M. Houston Jr." And I said, "Wait, that would make our James 3. Do you remember what your name was?" And he'd always say, "James." His name is James. It never really occurred to us. We thought he just wasn't understanding the question. I was so excited. I'm like, "That's it." I'm like, "That's him. It's James M. Houston. His name is James. It's the James 3.
James Houston Jr., World War II Navy pilot. At age 21, on March 3rd, 1945, his plane was shot down over Chichijima. Now, the skeptical parents were sitting on compelling proof that their little boy really was reincarnated.
So I said, "Do you remember any friends or anyone else that you flew with?" And he said, Jack Larson.
And Jack Larson, the Navy buddy little James recalled? Well, it turns out there was a pilot named Jack Larson who served aboard the Natoma.
This is insane, right? This entire story just blows my mind. It gives me chills. Anyway, so exactly like the other boy in this series, James could remember that he also had siblings in his former life. James's parents managed to track down this woman that James was claiming to be his sister, well, James Houston's sister, and they got in contact with her.
She didn't know what to think about the little boy who claimed to be her brother reincarnated.
The child was so convincing and coming up with all these things that there's no way in the world he could know.
But then, James asked her for a painting that only one person other than her knew existed.
She sent this January 16th, 2006. I had asked her for a painting that my past mother had done for her and me. This was in her attic for 50 or so years. My parents and she thought it was crazy that I would know about something like that. After my husband and I did extensive research based on what James had told us, we were able to determine that James was remembering the life of a fighter pilot who'd been killed during World War II at the Battle for Iwo Jima. His name was James M. Houston, Jr. And when his family sent us the initial package of photographs, we were amazed by the striking resemblance between James M. Houston, Jr., the fighter pilot who was shot down in World War II, and our own son, James. Bruce is like, "Hey, James, what are you going to name your G.I. Joe?" He's just playing, he goes, "Walter." So we were like, "Walter?" Bruce goes, "How come you named your G.I. Joes Billy, Walter, and Leon?" And he goes, "Because that's who met me when I got to heaven." And it was one of those moments where, like, the blood drained out of our face, and we just kind of walked backwards. Bruce went in the office. I went in the office. We closed the door. He's in there going through papers like this. I'm like, "What are you looking for? What are you looking for?" He finds this piece of paper, and he's like, and he says, "Billy Peeler, Walter Devlin, and Leon Connor were all in the same squadron as James Houston." I was like, "When did they die? Did they die before?" He's throwing papers around, pulls out another sheet, and he looked at the dates of death, and they all died before James Houston died.
They all flew with.
At this point, James's parents decide to take him out to the spot where his plane went down, back when he was James Houston in 1945.
Thou who art the pilot of the souls of men.
The boat was right above where the wreckage of the plane was. And Bruce did this beautiful memorial service, and so I thought that was a perfect moment for me to just say, I sat down with him and I said, Jim Houston's been a part of your life for as long as we can remember, and he's always going to be an important part of who you are, but you have a life to live as James Leininger, and it's time for you to say goodbye to Jim Houston. And he just started bawling. And he cried for about 20 minutes.
Yeah, he had everyone.
It was the saddest thing I ever seen.
He had everyone on the boat
crying. It's time for us to say goodbye. James Houston. Goodbye, James and Houston.
Good job.
I salute you.
Good boy. So brave. You're such a brave soul. Such a brave soul and spirit.
It was weird when we got back to shore. It was something had changed.
He left something there.
He really did. It was palpable. You could see that he'd mourned that and everything that had happened and was ready to move. I salute you.
Good boy. So brave. You're such a brave soul. Such a brave soul and spirit.
It was weird when we got back to shore. It was something had changed.
He left something there.
He really did. It was palpable. You could see that he'd mourned that and everything that had happened and was ready to move on. And he really did at that point. That's kind of when everything really changed.
I believe that he had a past life. I believe that in his past life he was James M. Houston, Jr. And he came back because he wasn't finished with something.
There is something else out there. After this, it's not over when you die.